Hello, everyone. Tonight we dive into a story that has haunted the small mountain town of Evergreen, Colorado, for decades. It's a chilling tale of mystery, loss, and secrets buried deep beneath the snow. In 1995, 6 teenagers disappeared during what was supposed to be a carefree ski trip. No one could explain what happened to them, and for years, the case went cold. But what was found 25 years later is something truly horrifying. Before we dive into the story, I have to warn you. This channel is not for everyone, only for those brave enough to uncover dark secrets. If you're ready to hear truths that will make you question everything you think you know about life, about the things that are hidden in plain sight, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let us know where you're watching from, because this story could happen anywhere in the United States. Now, let's get started. The year was 1995. A group of 6 teenagers, all close friends from Evergreen High, embarked on a ski trip to the remote Peak Mountain Resort, located deep in the Colorado Rockies. The weather had been unpredictable that season, with thick snowstorms swirling through the narrow mountain roads. But they didn't let that deter them. They were looking for adventure, something to remember. They never returned. At first, it was just a delay. The group had planned to return on a Sunday night, but they hadn't arrived by morning. That's when the parents started calling. Then the police were notified. Search teams combed through the woods, retracing the paths they believed the teens had taken. Helicopters scoured the vast mountain range, but there was no sign of them. No footprints, no ski tracks, nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the search was called off after it became clear the group was lost, or worse, had been caught in an avalanche. The mountain was relentless, and its cold grip held its secrets tightly. As years passed, rumors spread, but no one had any answers. The town of Evergreen tried to move on, but the scar of the disappearance remained. The families of the missing teens were left with only unanswered questions. Where had they gone? Why was there no trace of them? The disappearance was officially marked as unsolved, a tragic event that would forever haunt the town. Then, in 2020, something unimaginable happened. A survivor, presumed dead, was found living alone in an abandoned cabin, just outside of the same mountain range where the teenagers had vanished. The survivor was barely recognizable. Their clothes were torn and ragged, their skin pale, almost translucent, as though they'd been hidden away from sunlight for years. The sight of this person, and the fact that they had somehow survived, was both baffling and terrifying. When the news broke, the town was thrown into a frenzy. It was as if the past had come alive, dragging its dark secrets back into the light. The survivor was identified as Nathan Grayson, the youngest of the missing teens. His reappearance forced the authorities to reopen the case. which had been cold for over 2 decades. As investigators rushed to interview Nathan, they were confronted with a confused and frightened young man, someone who appeared to have barely escaped the grip of something sinister. He was disoriented, speaking in broken sentences, unable to fully explain what had happened. What he did recall, however, was enough to send a chill down the spine of every person listening. Nathan spoke about strange things, shadows in the woods, whispers in the snow, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. He mentioned a cabin, a place where he'd been held, and the others. He recalled hearing their voices, but not seeing them. As his memories slowly resurfaced, it became clear that something horrific had happened to him and his friends during that trip. Something unnatural. But Nathan's story didn't just unsettle the investigators, it left them with more questions than answers. How had he survived? Where were the others? What had really happened to them? The reopening of the case sent a ripple through the community. Families of the other missing teens were eager for answers. And yet, with every new lead, it felt like the truth was slipping further away. The survivors' fragmented recollections were just the beginning. What lay ahead was a journey that would take investigators into the heart of the mountain, into the dark secrets of the town, and into a horrifying truth no one was prepared for. Nathan's reappearance was like a spark in the dark, igniting the long, smoldering curiosity and fear that had consumed Evergreen for years. The town had been living with this wound, an open mystery that no one dared to touch. Now, with Nathan standing at the center of it all, the unanswered questions began to resurface, twisting deeper than anyone could have imagined. As soon as Nathan was found, the authorities scrambled to piece together the fragments of his memory, hoping to get any clue that could shed light on the mystery. But the survivor's condition was fragile, both physically and mentally. The first interviews were disjointed, filled with incoherent ramblings. He spoke in brief spurts, sometimes muttering to himself, and other times freezing, as if he were hearing something no one else could. He spoke about the snow, the endless white walls, and the oppressive silence that had surrounded him. But when it came to the other teens, his mind seemed to retreat, as though the memories were too painful to revisit. It was clear that Nathan had been through something traumatic, something that had torn away the very fabric of his reality. He was not the same person who had gone on that ski trip 25 years ago. Those who knew him before the trip, his family, his friends, could hardly recognize the hollow figure standing before them. The investigators, however, knew they couldn't afford to be sympathetic for long. Time was of the essence. Every lead that had been dormant for so long was now suddenly vital. A decision was made to start with the cabin where Nathan had been found, hoping that it would provide something, anything that could help explain how a survivor had ended up there. The search team headed up into the mountains, navigating the treacherous, winding roads that led to the remote cabin. The weather was typical for this time of year, with a biting wind cutting through the air and the snow falling in thick, almost suffocating curtains. The mountain felt like a living entity, its quiet expanse holding secrets beneath the surface. As the cabin came into view, it looked as though it had been abandoned for much longer than a few years. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the snow around it had drifted high, burying parts of the structure. The only sign of life was a faint trail of footprints that led from the cabin into the surrounding forest Nathan's. Most likely, inside, the air was thick with decay. The faint smell of mildew and dampness permeated the room. Old furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust, was scattered around. But what stood out most was the absence of anything personal. There were no signs of life, no belongings, no evidence that anyone had lived here recently. The only thing that caught the attention of the investigators was a crude map tacked to the wall, hastily drawn and yellowed with age. The map showed a portion of the surrounding mountains, but it wasn't detailed in the way you might expect. There were no clear trail markers, no tourist spots, just strange markings, circles, X and arrows. A set of coordinates was written at the bottom, with no explanation. The symbols felt deliberate, like they were meant to guide someone. But to where and why, the investigators were intrigued. But they knew they couldn't make any assumptions just yet. They returned to Evergreen, taking the map with them, hoping it would lead to something more concrete. As Nathan recovered in a nearby hospital, more details began to emerge. He had been found in a state of near starvation, with physical injuries that suggested he had been trapped for years. But even more disturbing was his psychological state. He was withdrawn, unable to make eye contact, and his speech was a mix of confusion and terror. His only coherent statements were about the others, the other teens who had gone missing, who he said were still out there in the mountains, waiting, but no one knew what to make of this. Was it the ravings of a traumatized mind? Or was there something deeper to his words? The authorities knew they had to get more information. Nathan was their only link to the past, but the path he had opened was tangled in dark, twisted threads that led nowhere. The first thing they did was look into the other missing teens. All 6 had been friends for years. There was Emily, the athlete with a competitive spirit, Mark, the quiet one who always preferred to observe, Sarah, the class clown, always making everyone laugh, Jack, the joker with a heart of gold, Rachel, the bookworm who never quite fit in with the others but was fiercely loyal, and Nathan, the youngest, always tagging along. They were inseparable, always together, until the trip that changed everything. At first, the investigation centered around finding out if any of the teens had been seen leaving the resort. But there were no witnesses. No one had seen them after they'd set off for the slopes on that fateful morning. Theories began to swirl. Had they gotten lost in the snowstorm? Had they been caught in an avalanche? But the longer the case dragged on, the less likely those explanations seemed. A breakthrough came when a forensic team began analyzing the items Nathan had been wearing when he was found. A torn jacket, a pair of boots, and a small, nearly destroyed backpack. It wasn't much, but among the wreckage, they found something that raised more questions than answers. A photograph, half buried under layers of snow. It was a picture of the 6 teens, taken just before the trip, smiling and happy. But what stood out was the backdrop. They were standing in front of a small, seemingly ordinary building that none of the group had ever mentioned. The building was old, run down, and hidden behind a thick wall of trees. The photo had been taken at the foot of a steep hill, the area barely visible from the main road leading up to the resort. It was clear the teens had ventured off the beaten path, but why? This one small photograph sent the investigation into a new direction. Was there a place they had stumbled upon that no one knew about? Something that could explain their disappearance. As the investigation continued, each new lead began to paint a clearer picture. The mountain silent, snow-covered, and unforgiving, held secrets that had been buried for far too long. And as the search for the truth deepened, it became increasingly clear that what had happened to those teenagers was no ordinary mystery. The photograph of the teens standing before that eerie building became the key to everything. For investigators, it was a clue, a thread they could follow to unravel the mysteries that had been kept hidden for over 25 years. They couldn't ignore the fact that the teens had clearly ventured into an area that hadn't been part of their planned route. It was a hunch, a dangerous one, but it was the only lead they had. The building in the photograph was located deep in the woods, and the path to it wasn't marked on any of the official maps of the mountain area. The local authorities were familiar with the resort and the surrounding terrain, but no one knew about this hidden spot. They needed answers, so a small team of investigators, led by Detective James Turner, set out to explore the area, hoping that the building would yield something of value. They weren't prepared for what they found. The road to the location was narrow and winding, and the further they ventured, the more oppressive the environment became. The trees seemed to close in around them, the wind howling through the dense forest, carrying with it the scent of something old, decayed. The mountain, which had once felt like a place of beauty and adventure, now felt sinister, as though it were hiding something dark beneath its frozen surface. When they reached the building, it looked even more disturbing in person than in the photograph. The structure was a small cabin, but it was unlike any cabin one would expect to find on a ski resort. It appeared ancient, as if it had been built long before the resort even existed. The windows were boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges, snow piled high around the foundation, and the ground was uneven, as though the earth had settled beneath it. The investigators carefully approached the building, their senses heightened. They knew this place held something important. But what? The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside, there were remnants of what seemed like an abandoned hideout, old blankets scattered on the floor, dried food wrappers, and rusted metal objects littering the space. The air was thick with dust. But there was something else, too. Something colder, a sense of dread settled over the team as they moved through the space, searching for anything that could explain the events of that fateful ski trip. It was then that they found something that made their blood run cold. In the back corner of the cabin, hidden beneath a pile of old tarps, was a trapdoor. It was old, but it had clearly been used recently. The wood around the edges was worn, the hinges creaking as they slowly pried it open. What lay beneath was a narrow staircase leading down into a pitch-black basement. Without hesitation, they descended, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder the further they went, and the smell became even more putrid, as though something had been rotting for years. When they reached the bottom, they were met with a sight they would never forget. The basement was small but filled with objects that defied explanation. Old cages, rusted and worn, lined one wall. On the opposite side, several wooden crates were stacked high, some partially open to reveal dark stains on the inside. The floor was covered in what looked like old blood stains, and the walls were marked with strange symbols that seemed out of place for this part of the world. As the investigators examined the scene, they realized that this basement had been used for something far darker than mere shelter. This was a place of confinement, a place where people had been kept against their will. The cages seemed to be designed for humans, not animals, and the crates appeared to contain personal belongings, torn clothes, scraps of paper with names written on them, and more photographs, some of which were remarkably similar to the one they had found in the cabin. Among the scattered items, one photograph caught their attention. It was an old, faded picture of a young girl, no older than the missing teens had been when they disappeared. Her face was partially obscured by shadows, but she was holding a sign with the same symbols that had been etched into the basement walls. Detective Turner's heart sank as he realized what he was seeing. This wasn't just a random group of teenagers who had gotten lost. This was something far more systematic, more insidious. These symbols, the cages, and the photographs all pointed to a hidden network, something dark and far-reaching, possibly linked to trafficking and abductions that had been going on in this region for years. The evidence was damning, but it also raised more questions. How many others had been kept here? How long had this place been operating? And what exactly had happened to the missing teens? As they continued to investigate, it became clear that the cabin and its hidden basement were not isolated incidents. There were more clues, more places like this scattered across the mountainside. What was once a quiet, peaceful resort had a far more sinister history, one that had been carefully concealed for decades, back in Evergreen. The town was starting to buzz with rumors again. People were beginning to realize that the disappearances weren't random. The local authorities were taking the case more seriously now. But with each new discovery, the gravity of what had happened so many years ago began to sink in. The missing teens were never just victims of a tragic accident. They had been part of something much darker. Nathan's survival, though miraculous, now seemed like the beginning of a much larger, much more dangerous story. The truth was starting to surface, piece by piece. But each new revelation only led to more questions. The investigation had moved beyond the missing teens. It was now about uncovering the hidden network that had preyed on them, and the many others who had come before them. But the more the investigators delved into the truth, the more they realized they were up against something far larger than they could have imagined. So you're still following this story, right? If you're still listening, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Share your thoughts. I'm really curious to hear what you think about what's happened and what's unfolding. As the investigation deepened, so did the mystery of the cabin, the symbols, and the disturbing discoveries made in that hidden basement. Detective Turner and his team found themselves tangled in a web of secrets far darker than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just about 6 missing teens. This was about an underground network that had been operating for years, hidden in plain sight. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the mountain, the town, and even the resort had been playing host to something far more sinister than they could have ever anticipated. The police were now certain that the cabin wasn't the only one of its kind. The location where they had found Nathan was just the beginning of a much larger investigation. One that would stretch deep into the mountainside and beyond. The question was, how long had this network been active? And who had been behind it all? They had a few clues to work with. The strange symbols in the basement. The names written on scraps of paper. And the photographs were starting to paint a chilling picture. The names on those scraps were all too familiar, not just of the missing teens, but of other people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances over the years. Some were local to Evergreen. Others were visitors. But all had one thing in common: they were never found, and their disappearances were often dismissed as accidents or unfortunate coincidences. But as Turner and his team looked closer, they saw a pattern emerging. A pattern of missing persons that stretched back decades, and all roads seemed to lead back to this very mountain. The deeper they dug into the town's history, the more unsettling things became. Old records, long forgotten by the authorities, revealed that the resort had once been under different ownership, and the previous owners had a dubious reputation. The locals spoke of strange disappearances that had occurred years before, long before the ski resort was even built. It seemed that the mountain had always been a place of shadow, a place where people had come to disappear. But no one had ever connected the dots until now. As Turner pieced together the fragments, he began to get the sense that the key to understanding the network was not just the cabin, but something even older. The symbols they had found in the basement, a twisted combination of ancient runes and modern graffiti, seemed to be a form of communication. Whoever had been involved in this operation had been using these symbols to mark their territory, to communicate with one another, and perhaps to warn others of who was watching. It wasn't long before Turner discovered that the cabin and its underground chamber were just part of a much larger, hidden facility. The original owners of the resort had built a series of tunnels underneath the mountain, connecting various hidden locations. These tunnels weren't just for storage or utilities. They were designed to be used for something far darker. Turner's team located one of these tunnel entrances, buried beneath an old, decrepit building that had once been a lodging facility for ski instructors. The place had been abandoned for years, but it was here, under the frozen earth, that they found another hidden door. The passage was narrow and winding, leading deep underground. As they ventured down, their flashlights barely pierced the thick darkness that surrounded them. The temperature dropped significantly as they descended, the air growing damp and heavy. The walls of the tunnel were rough, unpolished, as if they had been carved hastily by human hands. At the end of the passage, they found a heavy metal door, locked and sealed shut. They forced the door open, and what they found inside sent a chill through their spines. It was a sprawling underground complex, filled with rows of small, cell-like rooms. Each room was furnished with nothing but a bare mattress on the floor, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and chains bolted to the walls. The rooms were old, but they had been used recently. Some of the chains still had fresh rust on them, evidence that they had been in active use not long before the authorities had arrived. The entire facility had been hidden for years, buried deep within the mountain, just below the surface where no one would look. And now, as Turner and his team explored the complex, they began to realize that the missing teens had not just vanished, they had been taken, brought here to be held against their will, likely for a much darker purpose than anyone could have imagined. The discovery was staggering, but it also raised more questions. Who had been behind this operation? Who had built the tunnels and hidden the complex? And most chilling of all, how many others had suffered the same fate as the missing teens? As Turner and his team continued their search of the underground facility, they began to uncover even more disturbing evidence. They found journals, written in a hurried, almost frantic handwriting. These journals spoke of control, of manipulation, and of an unrelenting need to maintain secrecy. The author, whose identity was unclear, described the operation in chilling detail, how people had been chosen, taken from their homes, or lured into the mountain under false pretenses, and then locked away in the underground complex. The entries painted a picture of a well-organized, systematic operation that had been running for decades, but there was more. In one of the journals, the author wrote about a final phase, a phase that involved the ultimate fate of those who had been kept in the complex. The entries were vague, but hinted at something far darker, something beyond simple confinement. The idea of disposal was mentioned more than once. Was this where the missing teens had gone? Were they merely kept for some time, before being disposed of in some unimaginable way? The investigators were on the brink of uncovering the full scope of this operation. But there was one crucial detail they had overlooked: the role of the survivor. Nathan, his fragmented recollections, his cryptic statements about the other teens, were more than just the ramblings of a traumatized young man. They were pieces of a much larger puzzle. Nathan knew more than he had let on, but how much and what had really happened to him during those years in captivity as they pieced the story together. Turner couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Whoever was behind this operation would do anything to keep their secrets buried. The question now wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about surviving long enough to expose it. The deeper the investigation went, the darker the rabbit hole seemed to become. With each new discovery, the investigators were coming closer to revealing the monstrous truth behind the missing teens. But they were also realizing how perilous their pursuit had become. Turner's team was no longer just chasing a mystery. They were unraveling a criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades. And now, it seemed that the people behind it were aware that the walls were closing in, despite the unsettling nature of their findings. Turner knew they couldn't stop now. The missing teens were just the tip of the iceberg, the underground complex, the journals, the strange symbols, and the eerie photographs all pointed to something much bigger, something that spanned across the mountain, and perhaps even beyond. The survivor, Nathan, had been adamant about one thing the others were still out there. He had mentioned hearing their voices while he was trapped, sensing their presence, but he had never seen them. He spoke of the mountain as if it were alive, an entity that was watching, waiting. To him, the mountain had become a prison, but also a haunting, a place where the trapped souls of the disappeared were somehow still connected, still echoing in the wind. As Turner reflected on Nathan's words, he began to understand the survivor's cryptic statements. Nathan had spent years in isolation, unable to piece together what had happened to his friends. But now, after everything they had discovered, it was clear that the other teens hadn't just disappeared into thin air. They had been taken to places like the one they had uncovered, hidden away in the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the mountain. But the mystery didn't end there. As the investigators dug further into the old records, they began to uncover connections to other missing persons cases, some going back as far as the 1960s. It was as if the resort had been built on top of a decades-old network of abductions. The authorities had never made the connection before, but now it was glaringly obvious. The missing teens, and countless others, had been part of a much larger, systematic operation that spanned years, preying on both locals and tourists. The question was, who was behind it all? Who'd been pulling the strings for so long? And why? Nathan's story was the key to unraveling this web of secrets. But getting the full truth out of him would require time, something they were running out of. The more Turner looked into Nathan's background, the more he realized how much the boy had been affected by the trauma he'd endured. Nathan had been through a psychological hell, and his fragmented memories were like shards of glass, each piece offering a glimpse into the horrors he had faced. But even he didn't know everything. There were gaps in his memory, moments that he couldn't or wouldn't talk about. One thing was clear, though. Nathan wasn't just a victim. he was a survivor. And survivors often held the key to solving the puzzle, no matter how painful that truth might be. As the investigation continued, the pressure mounted. Turner knew that they were getting closer to the truth, but they were also coming closer to something far more dangerous. Their every move was being watched. The team received anonymous warnings, cryptic messages left at the station, and even threats delivered through seemingly innocent means. It was clear that whoever was behind the operation didn't want their secrets uncovered. The town of Evergreen, once a quiet, peaceful community nestled in the mountains, was now on the brink of being torn apart. Fear spread like wildfire through the town, as locals began to realize that their seemingly idyllic surroundings had been hiding a deadly secret for years. The ski resort, once a symbol of winter fun and adventure, was now seen as a place where people had vanished without a trace. A place where something sinister had been brewing under the surface for decades. Turner and his team were close to discovering who was behind the abductions, but they knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed to gain Nathan's full trust, to get him to open up completely. But that was easier said than done. Nathan had lived through something no one could truly understand, something that had broken him in ways no one could predict. Every time he was asked to recall the events of that winter, he would shut down, his eyes glazing over as if he were slipping into a place that no one could follow. His mind, it seemed, was a battlefield, and the memories he held were too terrifying to revisit. One evening, as Turner sat with Nathan in the hospital room, trying to piece together the remaining fragments of the past, something changed. Nathan suddenly stopped talking. His face grew pale, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at Turner with a haunted expression, then muttered something that made the hairs on the back of Turner's neck stand on end. "They're still here," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling. "They're still out there, in the mountain. They never left." Turner leaned in, urging Nathan to continue. But the boy fell silent again, as if the words had drained him of everything he had left for a moment. It seemed as though Nathan had seen something so terrifying, so incomprehensible, that he couldn't bear to speak of it. But then, in a near whisper, Nathan finally spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I wasn't supposed to survive. I wasn't supposed to come back." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, each one carrying an ominous weight. What had Nathan meant? What was it that he had witnessed, or more likely? What had he been forced to endure that had made survival feel like a mistake? The truth was closer than ever. But with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that the mountain was hiding more than anyone could have imagined. And the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. The people behind the network were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that the secrets of Evergreen remained buried forever. As Turner left the hospital room that night, He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not only running out of time, they were running out of options. Whoever was behind the abductions was watching. And if the investigation continued, they would do whatever it took to ensure that the truth stayed hidden. The mountain, it seemed, was not just a place of beauty and adventure. It was a place of secrets. And those secrets, buried deep in its snow-covered heart, would not be easily uncovered. As the investigation dragged on, a sense of urgency settled over the team. Every lead they pursued seemed to only deepen the mystery, and the closer they got to the truth, the more it became clear someone, or something, was desperately trying to stop them. The warnings were getting more frequent, more direct. Threatening phone calls, anonymous letters slid under their office doors, and even strange cars parked outside the police station, their drivers staring into the building before disappearing into the night. But it wasn't just the threats that made Turner uneasy. It was Nathan. The more time he spent in the hospital, the more agitated he became. He had become a ghost of himself, withdrawn, his body trembling, as if he could hear something no one else could. On occasion, he would look out the window, eyes wide with terror, muttering to himself about the voices in the mountain. He was clearly tormented by something that wouldn't let him go. It became apparent that Nathan wasn't just suffering from post-traumatic stress. He was being haunted by something more sinister. The more Turner learned about the survivor's past, the clearer it became that Nathan was no longer just a victim. He had become part of the very system he had escaped. His fragmented memories, his terror, all pointed to a much deeper connection between him and the events that had unfolded. Nathan was bound to this mountain in ways Turner couldn't yet understand, but time was running out. The deeper the investigation went, the more it felt like the entire town was on the verge of breaking. The threats against the team were becoming personal. Turner had received a phone call at his home one evening. The voice on the other end was low, almost whispering, but it carried a cold menace. "You're too close. You have no idea what you're dealing with." The call ended abruptly, and Turner was left with nothing but the unnerving feeling that they had reached a point of no return. Despite the increasing danger, the team pressed on, determined to find answers. They began to focus more on Nathan's role in everything. If Nathan was involved in the network even unknowingly, then understanding his connection to the events was critical. But Nathan wouldn't talk. He had been so traumatized that each time they tried to push him for more information, he withdrew even further. It was as if there was a mental barrier he couldn't cross, a part of his mind that refused to let the truth come out. Turner decided to take a different approach. He went back to the town's historical records, hoping that the answers might be hidden in plain sight. Evergreen had always been a quiet town, but its history was filled with oddities and unexplained events. One of the earliest settlers of the area had been a man named Amos Hargrove, a man whose name appeared in several of the old town records. Hargrove had been a hermit of sorts, living on the mountain long before the resort had been built. according to the records. He had been obsessed with the idea of controlling nature specifically, the weather and the mountain itself. Hargrove had built a small cabin high in the mountains, away from the town, where he was said to have conducted strange experiments. According to local folklore, he had spent years studying the land, trying to harness its energy. No one had ever been able to confirm what Hargrove had done up there, but there were rumors of his involvement in the disappearances of several travelers who had ventured too far from the beaten path. Turner followed this lead, hoping it might shed some light on the history of the mountain. What he found was both disturbing and fascinating. Deep in the town's archives, Turner found a map that detailed the land surrounding Evergreen and Peak Mountain Resort. On it, there were markings, strange symbols, almost identical to the ones found in the cabin and the underground complex. The map was old, likely drawn during the time when Amos Hargrove was active. It showed areas of the mountain that had been untouched, areas that seemed to have been intentionally avoided by the town's founders. The more Turner examined the map, the more it became clear that Hargrove had been attempting to create a network of hidden locations on the mountain, a network that had lasted for over a century. Hargrove's obsession with controlling the land seemed to have led him to discover something that could manipulate the people who entered these locations. It was as if the mountain itself had a strange power over those who came too close, something that twisted the minds of its visitors and forced them to remain under its influence. This revelation sent chills down Turner's spine. Was this why the missing teens had been chosen? Had they somehow been lured into the mountain's grip? Just like those who had disappeared years before them, was the mountain and the network beneath it not just a place of physical confinement, but also a psychological trap. As Turner processed this information, he received an unexpected visit. It was Nathan, standing in the doorway of his office, pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "They know," Nathan whispered, his voice shaking. "They know what I'm trying to remember. They know everything." Turner stood up, a knot forming in his stomach. He gestured for Nathan to sit down, but the boy refused. Pacing the room in an agitated state, the mountain. Nathan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a place. It's like a mind. It watches, it listens, and it takes." Nathan's eyes darted around the room, as if he were afraid someone was listening. Turner was speechless. He had heard of the psychological toll the mountain had taken on Nathan, but he had no idea it had been so deep. Was this the result of years spent in isolation, or was it something more? Something tied to the mountain's strange power? Nathan took a step closer to Turner, his face now inches away, his breath shallow. "I didn't just survive," he said, voice trembling. "I escaped. But they'll never let me go. They'll never let any of us go." The room felt colder, and Turner's heart raced. Was Nathan talking about the network, Or was he talking about something else, something far more sinister? Nathan collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at Turner. His eyes filled with terror. They're still here. Turner, watching us. They know we're getting too close. The weight of Nathan's words hung heavily in the room, thick and suffocating, like the very air had turned cold and dense. Turner stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing to process what Nathan had said. Could it be true? Was the mountain, as Nathan claimed, somehow alive? A malevolent force that had been silently influencing the events that had unfolded over decades? Or was Nathan simply a victim of his own tortured mind? His reality distorted by the trauma he had suffered, but Turner couldn't dismiss what he had seen and heard so far. There was something deeply wrong about all of this, the hidden cabins, the underground network, the strange symbols. And now Nathan's cryptic warnings. Something was lurking beneath the surface of Evergreen. And it wasn't just a group of criminals running a human trafficking operation. No, this was something far more intricate, far more insidious. Nathan's eyes were wide with terror, his breathing shallow, as if he were about to collapse under the weight of his fear. I didn't just escape, Turner. I was meant to escape. He paused, glancing nervously around the room as though the walls themselves might be listening. They wanted me to come back, to remember. But they didn't want me to leave. They needed me to tell you the truth. Turner's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a case anymore. Nathan wasn't speaking in the same disjointed, confused way he had been during earlier interviews. There was clarity in his words now, a desperation to be understood, to be believed. Turner knew he couldn't ignore him. What truth? Nathan Turner asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Nathan swallowed hard, his voice trembling. The mountain. It has always taken. People come here, disappear, and they don't leave. Not truly. Not in the way we think. Their bodies vanish, but their minds. They're part of it. Part of the mountain. The people who've gone missing, they're still here. Trapped. I can hear them. They're in the snow, in the wind, in the trees. Turner stepped closer, his mind racing. The idea that the mountain could possess something as intangible as a mind was preposterous. But given what they had already uncovered, could it be possible that something darker and more pervasive had been at work all along? Perhaps this was more than just a place where people went missing. Maybe it was where they were broken, mentally and physically, until they became one with the land itself. Nathan continued, his words now coming in a rush, as if he had to get them out before the fear overtook him again. I wasn't supposed to survive, Turner. I was supposed to stay there with the others, to become part of it. But something happened. I didn't obey. I got away. But now, they won't stop. They won't let me forget. They won't let me be free. Turner's mind raced as he tried to connect the dots. He'd always suspected that there was more to the story than just a human trafficking ring. The missing teens, the isolated cabins, the hidden underground complex, it all pointed to something older, more ingrained in the mountain's history. But what Nathan was saying now, about being part of it, made Turner question everything. Who are they? Nathan, Turner asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Who's behind all this? Nathan's face contorted with fear as he looked up at Turner, his eyes wide and pleading. The ones who made the mountain what it is. The ones who've been here for so long, keeping it all alive. They've been here before the resort, before the town. They're like shadows. Turner, they hide in plain sight. You won't see them, but they see you. The room seemed to grow colder, and Turner felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. This wasn't just about missing teens. This wasn't even about a criminal network. It was something more, something ancient. The mountain itself was part of a much larger, insidious plan. And now it was clear that Nathan was the last link in the chain. He had escaped, but he was marked. And the others, the missing teens, were never meant to leave. Turner couldn't let it end like this. He had come too far to back down now. He needed answers not just for Nathan, but for the families of the other missing teens, for the entire town. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the door to his office creaked open. A chill ran down his spine as he turned to see one of his fellow officers standing in the doorway. Detective Sarah Clark, a trusted member of his team, was staring at him with a grim expression. "Turner," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You need to see this." Turner and Nathan exchanged a look. Nathan's eyes widened in terror, as if he had just realized something he had been trying to avoid. He grabbed Turner's arm, his fingers cold and clammy. "It's too late," Nathan whispered. "They know you're close. They're already watching." Sarah stepped into the room, her face pale, holding something in her hand. It was a small, weathered notebook, the cover torn and faded. She handed it to Turner, who stared at it in disbelief. The notebook was familiar. It was one of the journals they had found in the underground complex. But this one was different. This one was recent. "We found this," Sarah continued. "It was hidden in the attic of an old house just outside town. Someone wanted it to stay hidden." Turner flipped the notebook open, and what he saw inside sent a chill through his entire body. The pages were filled with notes, scribbled thoughts, instructions, and strange, almost incoherent writings. But what stood out was a single name. Repeated over and over on the first few pages, Amos Hargrove. The journal entries spoke of rituals, of controlling the land, and of binding people to the mountain. They mentioned a final phase, a way to bring the chosen back to the mountain to complete the cycle. And at the bottom of one of the final pages, in large, bold letters, was the word return. Nathan's eyes darted to the page, and his face went pale. "They're coming," he whispered. "They're going to take you, too." Turner closed the journal with a snap, his mind reeling. They weren't just investigating a missing persons case. They were dealing with something that went beyond human understanding. The mountain wasn't just a backdrop to these events. It was an active participant in whatever had been unfolding for over a century. And now, it seemed, Turner and his team were part of it too. "Turner," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not over. It's just beginning." The words echoed in Turner's mind long after Sarah had left the room. "It's not over. It's just beginning." The haunting finality of it all gripped his mind like a tightening fist. He sat there, staring at the notebook. The name Amos Hargrove burned into his memory. Nathan's warnings, the strange symbols, the chilling discovery of the underground complex, it was all leading them somewhere darker, deeper. They were no longer just chasing shadows. They were in the midst of something ancient, something far beyond their comprehension. As Turner looked at Nathan, the boy seemed to shrink under the weight of what they were uncovering. He was trembling, his eyes wide with terror, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Turner had seen fear before, but this was different. Nathan wasn't just afraid of the people behind the abductions or the mountain's hidden network. He was afraid of the mountain itself. And as Turner continued to stare at the journal in his hands, he couldn't help but wonder if Nathan was right. If there was something far more sinister at work, something far more insidious than a criminal ring. Nathan had been trying to tell them something, trying to warn them. But it was clear now that the mountain's hold on him was stronger than ever. The boy wasn't just a victim. He was a pawn, manipulated by something he couldn't escape. "We need to go back," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to go to the mountain. It's the only way." Turner shook his head. "No, Nathan. We need to get you somewhere safe, somewhere away from all of this. You're not well." But Nathan was adamant. His eyes locked onto Turner's, and for the first time in days, there was a clarity in his gaze. "You don't understand," he said urgently. "It won't stop. You won't stop. The mountain won't let you go. It's calling us back. It's already too late." There was an edge to Nathan's words, a coldness that Turner had never seen before. It wasn't the frantic, confused boy who had been found in the cabin. This was someone who had fully embraced the mountain's grip, whether he wanted to or not. "I'll go with you," Nathan added, almost pleading. "I'll show you the place. I'll show you where it all started." For a moment, Turner considered refusing. But deep down, he knew Nathan was right. They had to face it. They couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The journal, the symbols, the stories about Amos Hargrove, they all pointed back to one place, the mountain. And if they didn't go, if they didn't understand what had happened to the others, The cycle would continue. It always had, with a heavy sigh. Turner stood up, his mind made up. "We'll go together," he said, his voice firm. "But we're taking the proper precautions. We're not going in blind." Nathan nodded, relief flooding his face. He grabbed his jacket, and together, they made their way out of the building and into the cold night. The wind howled through the streets of Evergreen, sending a chill through Turner's bones. He had been to the mountain countless times, but this was different. The town, once quiet and safe, now felt like a cage, a place where the past and present collided. And no one could escape the consequences. The drive to the mountain was quiet, the tension between them palpable. As they neared the outskirts of town, the familiar landscape began to change. The snow thickened, and the roads became less traveled, less familiar. The mountain loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, its jagged peaks cutting into the sky like the teeth of some ancient beast. Turner couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was watching them, its icy grip waiting to pull them deeper into its secrets. When they reached the base of the mountain, Nathan pointed to a narrow path that veered off the main road. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Turner took a deep breath and nodded, signaling to his team to follow. They began to walk up the trail, the sound of their boots crunching in the snow, the only noise breaking the stillness. The air grew colder, the wind biting at their skin. As they ascended, the feeling of being watched intensified. Turner kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, in the dark shadows behind them. As they reached a small clearing, Nathan stopped. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the area. And then he turned to Turner. "This is where it began," Nathan said quietly. "This is where they first brought us. The others." Turner's heart pounded in his chest. The snow was thick here, and the trees around them were tall and silent. The air seemed to hum with an energy that Turner couldn't place, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that made it hard to breathe. This place, this clearing, felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold or the isolation. There was something else, something deep in the earth, something that was drawing them in. Nathan stepped forward, his eyes focused on a patch of snow in the center of the clearing. He bent down and brushed aside the snow, revealing a set of worn, ancient stones arranged in a circle. The symbols that had appeared in the journal were etched into the stones. Weathered but still clear enough to make out. "This is the ritual site," Nathan whispered. "The place where they took us, where they made us part of it." Turner's pulse quickened. He crouched down beside Nathan, his eyes scanning the stones. The symbols were identical to those they had found in the underground complex. The same markings that had been etched into the walls. The same markings that had haunted Nathan's memories. "This is where it all started," Nathan continued, his voice hollow. This is where they brought us, and where they took the others. Turner looked around, his mind racing. They had found the center of it all. But what had happened here? What had been done to the missing teens, to Nathan, that had left such an indelible mark on their minds, on the mountain itself, before Turner could ask another question? Nathan's eyes widened in terror. He grabbed Turner's arm, pulling him back. "They're here," Nathan said urgently. "They're watching. It's happening again. We have to leave now." Turner didn't need to be told twice. He turned to his team, signaling them to move. But as they turned to leave, a deafening sound echoed through the trees, a deep, resonant hum, as if the very earth beneath them was vibrating. The wind picked up, swirling the snow in chaotic gusts, and then, through the trees, Turner saw them, shadows moving swiftly in the distance, figures that weren't human, or at least didn't look human. The silhouettes of men, women, and children, all standing perfectly still, watching them. "They're not gone," Nathan said, his voice trembling. "They're still here." The mountain had never let go. And now, neither could they. The figures standing just beyond the trees were not simply figures. They were too still, too unnatural. Turner's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to focus, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The wind howled around them, but the figures remained silent, motionless, as if waiting for something. The feeling of being watched intensified, like the weight of the mountain itself was pressing down on them. Nathan was shaking, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "It's them," he whispered. "The ones who never left. The ones who are part of the mountain." Turner's mind raced. This couldn't be real. These people, these things, couldn't be real. They had to be a product of Nathan's fractured mind, or worse, a hallucination caused by the trauma. But deep down, Turner knew better. The journal, the symbols, the underground complex, it all pointed to something far darker than they had imagined. "Get back to the truck." Turner ordered his team, his voice calm but strained. Now, he reached for his radio, trying to communicate with the rest of the team stationed at the base of the mountain. But the signal was dead. Static hissed through the air, and the radio crackled uselessly in his hand. He turned back to Nathan, who was still staring at the figures, his breathing shallow and ragged. "They're not just dead," Nathan whispered, his voice cracking. "They're part of it. They're bound to the mountain, like me." Turner took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to stay calm. He had to get Nathan out of there, get answers. But everything felt like it was closing in. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. And then, one of the figures moved, slowly, its head tilted toward them, and Turner's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, impossibly still, with an unsettling calm that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It took a step forward, and Turner's heart hammered against his rib cage. Who are you?" Turner called out, his voice firm, though it shook with unease. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took another step, then another, its movements smooth and deliberate, as if it were gliding across the snow. Turner felt his pulse race faster. There was something wrong about the way it moved, something otherworldly, unnatural. This wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Nathan's hand shot out, grabbing Turner's arm with surprising force. "You can't talk to them," he said, his voice rising with panic. "They don't answer. They don't speak. They just watch." Turner tried to pull away, but Nathan held him tight. The other figures, too, were moving now, their motion slow, deliberate. They were closing in. "They're coming for us," Nathan gasped. "They're going to take us back to the mountain. You can't stop it. It's too late. We've crossed the line." Turner looked over his shoulder at his team, but they were already moving toward the truck. They were too far away to help. And then Turner saw it. A shadowy figure standing behind the group, too still to be mistaken for anything but a watcher. It was cloaked in darkness, its form barely discernible against the snow, but its presence was overwhelming. It was watching them with something like anticipation. Before Turner could react, the figure in front of him took another step. He could feel the ground beneath him vibrate slightly, like the mountain itself was responding to the presence of these beings. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and Turner could see his breath in the air. Then, suddenly, Nathan collapsed to his knees, clutching his head in agony. I can't go back," he cried, his voice muffled by his hands. "I'm not strong enough. It won't let me leave." The sound of his screams echoed through the clearing, but the figures didn't flinch. They continued to approach, their movements more like a slow, predatory dance, calculated and unhurried. Turner felt the first stirrings of panic crawl up his spine. He couldn't let Nathan be taken again. He couldn't let the others fall victim to whatever was happening here. "No," Nathan Turner shouted, rushing to his side. But before he could reach him, the first figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and touched Nathan's shoulder. Nathan screamed, a primal, bone-chilling scream that reverberated through the clearing, piercing the silence of the mountain. His body jerked violently, as though something was trying to drag him into the earth itself. Turner lunged forward, trying to pull Nathan away, but the figure's grip was unyielding. It felt like ice itself, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to freeze his very soul. The other figures moved in faster now, their hands outstretched, reaching for Nathan, reaching for Turner. Turner's heart pounded, but his mind was frozen in terror. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The mountain had claimed them both, and there was no escape. But just as the figures were closing in, the ground beneath them began to rumble. It was faint at first, like a distant tremor, but it grew louder, stronger. And then the earth itself cracked open beneath their feet. Turner stumbled backward, his heart racing as the ground split, revealing a dark abyss beneath the snow. It was as if the mountain itself was opening up to swallow them whole. No, Nathan screamed again, struggling against the figure's grip. It's too late. You have to stop it. It's coming for you. But it was already too late. The shadowy figure before them stepped forward, its face now visible, its eyes glowing a cold, piercing blue. It locked eyes with Turner. And in that moment, everything he had believed about the world, about reality, shattered. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it reached out with its cold hand, touching Turner's chest, and everything went dark. The darkness that swallowed Turner was suffocating, all-encompassing. For a moment, he thought he had died, that the mountain had finally claimed him. He could feel the icy grip of the figure on his chest. Its presence more than physical, it was a force, an unnatural cold that seeped into his very bones. His limbs felt heavy, numb, as though he were sinking into the earth itself. But then, just as quickly as the darkness had taken him, it receded. Turner gasped, sucking in air as his body jerked back to life. He was lying on the cold, hard ground, surrounded by snow. But there was no sign of Nathan, no shadowy figures, no ominous presence watching him. It was as if everything had disappeared, and he was alone in the middle of the mountain, in a silence so profound it seemed unnatural. The air was still, and the temperature had dropped even further. Turner sat up slowly, his heart racing in his chest. His head throbbed as he looked around, trying to make sense of where he was. The clearing was empty, save for the faint traces of footprints leading toward the edge of the mountain. He stood shakily, his legs weak beneath him, and looked back toward the place where Nathan had fallen. There was no sign of him, no trace, no scream, no evidence of the struggle that had taken place only moments before. Had it been a hallucination, a product of the fear and exhaustion that had gripped him, or had something truly terrible occurred here? Something he couldn't fully comprehend. Turner, a voice suddenly called out. He spun around, instinctively reaching for his weapon. But it was only Sarah, running toward him, her face pale with fear. "Where's Nathan?" Sarah asked breathlessly. Looking around, eyes wide with panic, Turner's throat tightened as he realized the truth. "He's gone," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "The mountain, it took him. He's part of it now." Sarah's eyes darted around, trying to process the words. What happened? Turner, we heard your screams. We thought, I don't know. Turner shook his head, his voice catching in his throat. I tried to pull him away, but it was like the mountain had him, and then the ground. It opened up, and everything went black. Sarah glanced back toward the distant forest, her eyes scanning the trees as though expecting something to emerge. Is it over? Is it finally over? She asked, her voice trembling. Turner didn't answer. The feeling that something was still out there, watching them, crept back into his bones. He couldn't shake the image of the figures, their eyes glowing with that eerie blue light, their hands reaching out. It was as if they were part of the mountain itself, and the mountain would never let them go. I don't know, Turner murmured, his voice barely a whisper. But we're not safe here. We need to leave. We need to get back to town. As they made their way back down the mountain, the weight of the silence pressed in on them. The forest around them was still, almost unnaturally so. The wind had stopped completely, and the snow seemed to fall in perfect, unbroken sheets, as if nature itself had gone still. Turner couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was watching them, that it was waiting, patient and unyielding, for them to make the next move. When they reached the base of the mountain, the truck was still there, the engine running, the headlights cutting through the thick snow. Turner didn't hesitate. He opened the door and got inside, Sarah following closely behind. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine, the only sound that filled the vehicle. They reached the town of Evergreen just before dawn. The sky was dark, a storm still raging in the distance. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, and the streetlights flickered as they drove through the empty streets. It felt like the town was holding its breath, as though it, too, was waiting for something to happen. Turner's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He could still see Nathan's face, his terrified eyes, and hear his final scream as the figures surrounded him. And he could still feel the cold, the oppressive weight of the mountain that seemed to be calling to him, pulling him back toward it. When they pulled up to the police station, Turner didn't say anything. He couldn't. He didn't know how to explain what had happened, what he had witnessed. The files, the journal, the missing teens, it had all led to this moment. But the truth was something far darker than anything they could have ever anticipated. "We need to stop this," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We can't let this continue. We can't let the mountain take anyone else." Turner didn't respond. He stepped out of the truck, his feet crunching in the snow, and walked into the station, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. The mountain had taken Nathan. It had claimed him, just like it had claimed the others before him. And now, it was waiting for something or someone else to return. But who would be next, As Turner sat down at his desk, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, he could feel it. The mountain's presence was still with him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And in that moment, Turner knew one thing with absolute certainty: the mountain would never stop. It had never let go, and it never would. The only question left was whether anyone would be able to escape its grasp, and whether anyone would ever live to tell the truth.